Hi, guys. Welcome back to Neff Inspiration, my show on YouTube and as a podcast with me, your host, Stefan Neff. Today, I've got Ben Keys with me. Ben Keys is an amazing man who has been out on the front line and treating trauma for the better part of 40 years. This man has seen it all. He has developed his own heart system, and there could be so many topics I can touch upon today, and I can't wait to see where this interview goes. Ben, welcome to my show.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here.
Oh, wonderful. You have been so consistent. You have been in a field that is not very nice. You have worked with refugees. You have worked with on all kind of fronts. You have seen it all, and you have seen the darkness in humans. How the hell can you keep going, being exposed to that every single day?
Well, my main focus for a long time early was on sexual trauma. And out of that, in the last, I guess, 20 years, I've been working also with human trafficking survivors. And that's probably the darkest place because the survivors deal with memories that are just horrific. And um, the whole concept is something that just I don't get from a personal standpoint, but I do understand the pain and the hurt, and that's really what we reach to and what we try to work with. Sexual trauma affects many people. You go to any treatment center and you're dealing at least with anywhere from 10 to 20% of the entire center that has a history of early childhood sexual trauma or trauma as an adult, being assaulted or raped. Um, and the story after story after story. The one thing I do is I play as hard as I work. So um, getting time out and getting time to really air out is essential, and you've got to do that periodically, and it's the only way to keep going. Um, but you hear stories from refugees, all kinds of countries, whether it's South America, Africa, Europe, um, Middle East. The stories just get worse and worse, and the problems get worse and worse. The good news, though, is that healing is very possible, and I've seen miraculous things. I've seen people heal in an hour and a half. I've seen people that had been working for 10 years in therapy come together and be able to go out on their own. Um, it really depends on the person. It depends on where they are in the therapeutic process. And as we talked briefly, it really depends on their spiritual journey of how quickly that will move along.
I love the way that you phrase that because we can't do anything about the trauma. We can't do anything about the experiences of these people. I mean, I say of these people for crying out loud. I mean, the incidence of being raped is what, one in six, one in seven
Right.
amongst women
And that's
in the.
just women. Actually, it's 1 in 4 in women. It's 1 in 6 in men.
Oh, goodness. Okay, this has changed. And a higher incidence of sexual trauma when it comes to LGBTQ and transgender, I believe, when I looked at the statistics. So it is such a prevalent issue. And if you think about that, why? Has that changed in the United States? Has that always been like that and we just never knew what was behind the white picket fence or what happened in the remote farm in Montana?
And there's a lot of truth to that. It was taboo. We as a society, we refused to talk about it. And there are still societies like that. I did about 10 years of research back and forth in China. And, we would ask questions. We were trying to ascertain the level of dissociation, um, and comparing dissociative clients, which are typically sexual trauma and domestic violence, and sort of all the horrible things in the world. Um, we were comparing that with schizophrenia because some of the symptoms are very much the same.
Mm.
And we were asking questions about child abuse. And from the doctors to the clients, they would say, child abuse doesn't exist here. And we realized that finally that we were asking the wrong question. The question was, what do you do when a child that you're raising misbehaves? They beat the snot out of them. Ah, got it.
So in other words, 100% childhood
So, yeah,
abuse, for at least defined by our measures today. And I think
yes.
that is so important. If you had asked the same question in Germany 100 years ago, well, guess what answers you would have gotten there? And probably the
Yeah.
same in the United States or UK, in many societies. So it's hard to compare standards of 2024, especially the standards that we sort of dream of or imagine as being so wonderful. And with that, I mean sort of the very extreme left kind of thinking.
Mhm.
Compare that with the reality is often, I mean, there's quite a spread there of truth. And
Well,
it's,
what we were trying to decipher was what we were looking basically for dissociative or dissociation, which in this country, if you take it to its furthest extreme, would be dissociative identity disorder,
hmm,
which used to be called multiple personality disorder. And we actually found it to be at the same level in China, um, as 64 other countries in the world. Um, Basically, every country that we've been doing research in, DID exists at 1% of the entire population. And it's a direct result of early childhood sexual trauma before the age of 8.
wow,
97% is
wow,
based there.
wow, wow. 1% of the population. Now that's brutal.
It's a
Which is
lot
the,
of people.
which is the same. Well, actually, now let me put a cat amongst the pigeons. It's the same incidence or the same prevalence of psychopaths and sociopaths in the society. What's the Venn diagram there? Um, how many other things are linked with sexual abuse at such an early stage? And you specifically point towards sexual abuse. I was aware, of course, of the ACE studies, the adverse
Mm-hmm.
childhood experience studies that link a much broader kind of definition of adverse childhood experiences, not just sexual abuse to it. And when you look at these studies, I mean, there's huge flow-on effects, including direct impact on the health later on success, on so many aspects of life. When you focus directly on sexual abuse at a young age, what are the strong linkages there?
Um, the strongest linkage is just the confusion and the dysfunction.
Mm,
We used to believe that I mean, back in the 90s, we used to believe that with multiple personality disorder, these were all different personalities that would sort of grow up alongside of each other inside of one person.
mm.
What we found in the research is that it's a single personality that has fragmented. And that's what happens with the abuse. It becomes so overwhelming that the person's psyche as a child literally splits apart and compartmentalizes. And those parts grow up alongside of each other, often with different ages, different sexes, different functions.
Wow.
Um, I treated a woman, it must be 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that worked for a major corporation. She traveled to 3 different cities, and the fourth was she got to be home. So she was a survivor. And when she went to one area, she had a boyfriend in that town and would spend the week seeing him after work and dating. And then she'd fly to the next city and she would have a shift on the airplane and a live-in boyfriend, and their life was living on the beach and surfing and swimming and doing all of that. And then when she flew to New York, she lived a very I would say upper class life where she went to the opera and museums and art displays, and also with a live-in boyfriend. And then she'd fly back home to Tampa. She was married with 2 children, and the parts didn't know each other,
Oh, wow.
but they got talking inside her head because her corporation changed the cities that she was going to. So they lost their apartments, their boyfriends, and um, basically their lives. And so they started arguing inside her head, and she became so dysfunctional she had to quit.
Oh, wow.
She went on welfare um, because
Wow.
she couldn't work. She couldn't work anymore, and
Okay.
it took her. She was in the system for about 6 or 7 years before she was referred to me. Inappropriately diagnosed as schizophrenic, and it took 3 years of pretty hard work, but she was able to integrate those splits and come together. And I was
Wow.
using the methodology that I've recently written about,
Mm.
um, because it embraces the secular model. And because there's nothing wrong with the secular model, but it puts a spiritual overlay to it. That allows people that have a spiritual connection to incorporate that into the
Mm.
therapeutic process.
Beautiful.
And it's been modified to work. I work in a Christian university, Catholic university, and so the model definitely was written from a Judeo-Christian standpoint, but it's been modified to work with Islamic clients, with
Mm.
Buddhist clients, with Jain clients, um, and it still works.
And I think that's the beautiful thing, isn't it? Because if we can combine systems that allow to take the best out of each camp and utilize it, bring it together, and 1 plus 1 often gives you three. It works synergistically, and that is so wonderful. And that's amazing. It's beautiful to hear that. And it's so important because what you have described is the extreme version, the multiple personalities living within one person. Yet, what we have got is these traits to a lesser degree in most of us. They are becoming more pronounced the more shit you have gone through in your life, I guess, in an early stage. But I mean, 50% have probably not such great adaptive coping mechanisms, patterns that run. And suddenly you have got the women that are people pleasing as a direct response to trauma. So you don't need to be in the extreme camp to suffer from the flow-on effects. And I think that's so important. Many of us
Well,
are run by our
that's actually
subconscious.
what that's one of the things that we discovered is that if you look at the dissociative continuum, PTSD, borderline personality disorder, conversion disorder are
Mm,
all dissociative disorders. And it doesn't matter where the person is along that continuum because we're starting to be able to see that the application of the therapy process is the same.
mm,
We can apply it to especially borderlines um, because they have the divisions, but they don't have the amnesia between the parts.
correct.
So, and it's the same thing true with like survivors of war um, that have flashbacks and PTSD, and they come back. The disconnect is the flashback.
Mm,
The disconnect is are the triggers that set off that flashback
mm,
or reliving the experience. And it so debilitates the survivor
mm,
that very often they're not able to function. So the focus has got to be on that reconnection somehow.
mm,
And for the extreme, it's wearing down those walls of amnestic barriers.
mm,
So it's getting the parts to talk to each other. And the reality is we all have parts, but most of us are integrated in the sense that, like right now, I'm talking to you as a professor, but when I go into my other room, my son is there, my wife is there, and I talk to them and I am with them differently. I'm a father to my son, I'm a husband to my wife, but I have full knowledge of talking to you as a professor.
mm,
Um, and all of that stays together.
mm.
But they are clearly separate areas and separate ways that we behave and that we interact. Well,
And
as
I,
trauma,
I think that the key thing there is though to actually have the awareness that these things are happening because they're happening in the subconscious. They are happening, our behaviors are triggered by all these things, but it's all this nebulous kind of thoughts, emotions, mess up there that then results in a certain behavior that we do. And often enough, we have no idea why we respond, why we get triggered by a person, why we are on a hair trigger often and become very easily angry or very easily sad or commonly respond to something in a predictable manner that maybe is not appropriate. So it is this awareness that I think is missing in so many people because we live such busy lives. We try to escape our reality, and it's easier and easier with social media and with alcohol, you name it, any number of escape ways are there. And who is actually taking the time to actually sit still and is trying to figure out why do I behave in such a way? And I think that's where the
It's funny.
underdiagnosis comes from.
It's funny you should mention that, because that's basically the spiritual part of it for me, is being quiet enough to be able to connect to a very real God, and to be able to really hear, really see, and really understand what they've been through, and the parts of it, the ways they thought, the ways they protected themselves. And a lot of the dysfunctional behavior are things they do to protect themselves from ever feeling those feelings again. It's a
Exactly.
defense mechanism,
Exactly.
and is working through that defense mechanism and reconnecting both to themselves
Mm.
and to that spiritual part of themselves
Mm.
to heal.
Beautifully said. Having said that, uh, you have got this defense mechanism which very much served the purpose, even if it is in the long run not very productive and maybe is holding people back tremendously from the potential that they have. Yet it served a mechanism. It stopped the pain there and then. Same with addictions, same with any kind of these mechanisms. If you now have relied on this for 20 years, 30 years, by the time someone comes to you to see them, do you find that it is harder with 30 years? Or is it in fact easier? Because maybe now there's more maturity and more emotional intelligence there. What is your experience in reality?
Actually, because of the layering of trauma that often happens, children who are traumatized early are often traumatized again in adolescence and
Mm,
again as
mm,
adults. It's almost like a target is put on their back.
mm, mm, mm,
I mean, if you were to approach an animal like a dog that's been severely abused, they have certain behaviors that you pick up on very quickly.
mm,
The same thing is true for people, that they behave in certain ways that you pick up very quickly that something is very wrong. So not only can we understand that and pick that up, but those are the kinds of awarenesses that I think you're talking about, is how am I acting? How has it served me
mm,
to keep myself safe? And is it still doing that, or is it in my way?
mm,
And you mentioned addictions. Many of sexual trauma survivors are addicted to alcohol. They're addicted to drugs as a way of numbing themselves so they
absolutely.
don't have to feel. And it's a step-by-step process. The addiction is usually one of the last things that I would work with somebody to take away. Why? Because usually I find that as they start getting better, their use of the drug or the alcohol or whatever it is diminishes. So sometimes it clears up on its own.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, then that's when you step in and say, hey, we got to take care of this first.
Interesting, interesting. From an addiction point of view, you would think that actually you need to deal with abstinence first. You need to get them somehow into sobriety, because their befuddled mind is actually not able to comprehend the complexities or to deal with the trauma, etc. Um, so it's interesting to hear a different point of view, and I like that point
You
of view.
you
And I've
cannot take away the crutches all
absolutely,
at once.
absolutely.
And when you do that, you usually throw the client into probably more chaos than they want.
Hmm.
And usually that's when they leave, they go to somebody else. because they just can't function. And if there's any connection in the relationship, they're going to want to work through the issues, but at the same time they're going to constantly protect themselves. And it's that dance, it's that balance of how much do you allow when working with a client, the kinds of things that get in their way. I mean, for instance, I'm working with somebody right now where prior to coming to me, she was usually in the psychiatric hospital at least 200 days out of the year, almost every year. In, out, in for a week, out, in for another week, back out. In the 5 years I've been working with her, she's been in the hospital 3 times, no more than 2 days. And the reason is that as she starts getting well, she begins realizing what's in her way. Being in the hospital is in her way.
Nice.
It's a horrible place for survivors because they don't trust, rightly so, the other clients that are there. And more often than not, they don't trust the staff. And sometimes they're right there also.
That's
unfortunately.
You're quite right. Tell me more about heart. Tell me more about your mixture, or this bringing together of a spiritual, religious approach and a approach that is more common probably in the secular world.
It's interesting. The Bible talks about remembrance over 250 times. I mean, it's something that ties us to our memory. And memory is very important spiritually. So putting a narrative together of what's happened in your life, all those spaces that you can't remember, all those things that are disjointed in your thinking, all the distortions of the thinking. Well, we also have spiritual distortions. I can talk about myself. My spiritual awakening, if you will, was watching Charlton Heston when I was 8 years old, stand on this mountain with God throwing fire into this mountain, and that was a God to be afraid of. And I was for years. But when I really tapped into the loving part of spirituality, the loving part of God, that's also very real. And something I didn't know until I was in my 20s. Didn't really know until I was in my 20s. And nobody had answers for me. I started really, I think, from my master's on through several doctorates, I always had a minor in comparative religion because I kept looking for things. I found answers to my questions, but I find that clients that I see are also asking for answers to their questions. Where was God when I was raped? Where was God when I was sold? Where was God when I was trafficked and raped 8 times a day for 3 years? And quite honestly, I believe that God will give us those answers. And I've seen it in the process of the therapy. We work with the memory to be able to hopefully bring the client to a place of forgiving themselves. In other words, letting themselves off the hook because it wasn't their fault. They didn't do anything. This was done to them. But they will blame themselves as most children do. They blame themselves because children are very centric. The world revolves around them. But this is something that happened to them. And that's kind of the first part of the work, is getting through that process. But the second part of the work is realizing that God was there from the beginning, was there through the trauma, and is here with us now. That's one of the things that the Bible does talk about, is that God is with us always. And that's his promise, is that he never leaves us. It's finding and tapping into that to be able to appropriate it. It's kind of like you have a birthday and I give you a present. And you take that present, you put it into the trunk of your car. Now, I've given it to you, but it's totally worthless until you take it out of the car, open up the box, and take it out of the box, whatever's there. And that's really true about the things of God. They're given to us, but unless we learn how to appropriate them, it's worthless.
The story of the man who is stranded alone on a tiny island, and a ship comes along. He says, "No, no, 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 no! I've been praying to God. He will sort me out. No, no, thank you." And the next ship comes along, and so on and so on. He finally dies and gets up to heaven and says, "Where were you?" Yeah, well, I've sent you 7 ships. What more do you want me to do? So yes, we often do not recognize a gift that is given to us. But it can be very hard, and it's very, very difficult to move from being a victim to a survivor, and then from a survivor to a thriver. So I think it is making sense of the suffering. I think that is the hardest thing, making sense and finding a purpose in life again. Because so often do you get stuck in this victim role where you only identify with the things that have been done to you. Even if you say, no, it's not my fault whatsoever, you have done that step, but you're still stuck in that victim role. How does the heart system allow you to move from victim to thriver? Maybe even bypass the white knuckling survivor stage.
Well, first of all, people who have had a spiritual foundation somewhere in their childhood often skip steps and stages. Um, the model is a 10-step model, but it's not a linear model, it's a circular model. I mean, you can be working with memory one day and spirituality the next, and everywhere in between. It's finding the way out of what you hold yourself accountable for and being able to let that go. And finding a way to let go of whatever you're holding on to regarding the perpetrator. In other words, you let go of wanting an apology, wanting an acknowledgement, wanting a jail term, wanting whatever, because that's part of what's keeping you trapped.
Mm.
And it's letting go of the repayment to be able to move on. It's never, forgive and forget, and or
Mm.
uh, we never really talk about forgiveness of the perpetrator in this model because that may never happen. And yet other Christian models
Mm.
focus on it and beat it to death.
Mhm.
I really believe that if forgiveness of a perpetrator happens, it's an artifact of doing good therapy, because the client gets to a place where they are
Mm.
so excited about moving into their life
Mm.
that they're willing to
Mm.
let go of any kind of repayment.
Mm.
And that's what propels them. And coming to a place where God is very real in their life, um, where they can pray, talk, connect, and get answers and expect answers.
Mm.
We use a Benedictine monk technique of contemplative prayer, which is really just getting quiet enough to allow yourself to be in the presence of God
Mm.
and not doing anything, not talking, not praying, not nothing. But that's the process of the connection.
Absolutely. And it's interesting
Once
that you call that a form of prayer, because ultimately you could say this is meditation. You could say this is something else. There are many
it's all of
ways,
those,
many
yeah.
words that we can use for it, and whatever these words mean for an individual person with his and her own belief systems. I think
Mhm.
that if you look at the commonalities rather than what divides us, then it is that moment of quiet. That is, even
And
if you
that
don't believe in God or a deity of whatever nomination, you still find answers, because I believe that your brain, your mind, your spirit, whatever you are as a true whole energy being, not just the cells, but everything together, will come up with answers, with solutions. It comes up with a lot of bullshit too, but again, that's where your skill comes in, when you actually learn to be quiet and to use your mouth and your ears in the same ratio, 1 to 2. So listen more to the inside and actually see what comes out and investigate what these thoughts are. We know 80,000 thoughts a day, about 80% of them are negative. So there are a lot of lies in there. You're a
Mhm.
failure. You are worthless. You're
A
fat.
lot of negative messaging. Yes.
Exactly. And that's
And,
so common. And many of us believe in that. And I still catch myself. And I don't know where this program come from, but even 50, 80 years later, I am still a failure. It doesn't matter what I achieve. It doesn't matter how big my win list, my to-do list is that I ticked off today. I'm still a failure. I need to catch myself and tell myself, well, actually, no, you're not. You're not. You
Mhm.
showed up here this morning. You showed up and have had this beautiful conversation here with Ben. Now that is a win. But somehow
Mhm.
my brain wants to say,
Absolutely.
no, that's nothing, that's nothing, that's nothing. So it is, how do we deal with?
That has more to do with them than it has anything to do with you.
Hmm,
Somebody that's saying to you, that's nothing, that's nothing, that's nothing, and you internalize it, you start saying it yourself.
I'll see.
You got to find ways of reversing that and saying,
Hmm,
no, I have value and I have worth,
hmm,
and um, I can be well, I can heal.
hmm,
All positive messages that move you in that direction.
hmm.
I mean, affirmation is a simple technique, but it works very powerfully.
Doesn't it?
Visualization is a simple technique, but it
Hmm,
also works very powerfully.
hmm,
I mean, these are just some of the things that we use and some of the things that we do.
Mm.
My background, I mean, I grew up being Jewish and having a Christian conversion when I was in my late teens.
Uh-huh.
And then I refer to that as when I started wrestling with God. Um, Jacob and I have a lot in common. Um, but in that wrestling, I find really interesting kinds of things. For instance, Jewish tradition, mind, body, and spirit all reside in one place together, the heart.
Hmm.
The Bible also talks about the heart being where God resides. So to put the two together is to put God in the middle of our mind, body, and spirit. And that perspective can change somebody's life.
Mm. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful to. I'm often a bit jealous when it comes to those people around me who have been touched by Jesus Christ or who have a conviction that Allah is there for them, that they're walking side by side. I have not had this experience. I've had spiritual experiences where I believe in certainly bigger things than me. That yes, but I have not experienced maybe yet the joy that comes out of such a religion. Is there a way that you would say that you have found in your conversion where you were able to learn how to nurture that joy coming through?
I had to learn the same technique that I'm using. I had to learn to get quiet enough
Mm. Mm.
to be able to go inside and, first of all, see what's there, begin to clear out the mess, but to go inside and be willing to expose myself to what I call God. Other people use Allah or Yahweh. Um, and as I told you before we started, this model has been modified to work with Islam, Buddhist, Jain, Shinto, um, as well as Jewish clients. Just by modifying some of the tenets of it, it still works. And I'm convinced that God works on all kinds of levels, and God works with all kinds of religion. One of my highest experiences was actually in a Buddhist temple in China. Um, and I just wandered. It was a temple inside of a mountain. And I was there at a time when nobody else was there other than the caretaker. And I just got quiet and I could really sense just how intense the prayer had been in this temple. And just became so quiet and overwhelmed. And I had this high experience. I mean, it was like similar to drugs, really, of just an openness to spirituality. I think I laughed and cried for hours, um,
Beautiful.
alone here in this temple. It was amazing. Now, I don't get to talk about that very much because I do travel in mostly Christian circles. But I don't think God is contained. You know,
Beautiful. Yeah.
I think he's much bigger than that.
I love it. I love what you say. And you could go a little bit more to the fringe of religion and of the church when you actually look at what is in the Bible. Well, that was something that 400 years after Christ, people said, okay, we take that book, we take that book, we take that book, and we make that a Bible. Boom. But when you look at some of the other books, then there is actually far more spirituality there, where, where some books say Jesus lives in every one of us. Jesus is you, and the salvation is within you. Now, that doesn't go well with a church who would like to take money from you and who would like to keep the masses under control, which happened, from over the last many centuries. So it's interesting, and I think that is what you are describing. That is what you say. There is a power out there that sometimes manifests itself in strange ways, like in your case, in a mountain, in a different with a different so-called deity. Here you are having this wonderful, wonderful experience. But again, looking at
and,
commonalities, you were willing to stand still. You were willing to open up. You were willing to stop thinking.
and
The ego you were
and
putting to bed.
that's really the point of contemplative prayer, because that's the technique that's used, is you just get quiet enough to be in God's presence, in the
Mm,
spiritual
mm,
presence. And you begin knowing things, hearing things, you begin sorting things.
mm,
Um, what I like about the technique and why I use it is that it bypasses theology, it
mm,
bypasses denominationalism, and it bypasses polity. It stays away from all of that.
mm.
It's in the relationship. It's always been in the relationship.
Beautiful.
And as someone develops a relationship with God, that begins to steer them, that begins to move them in certain ways, and they know what's right for themselves.
Beautiful.
And survivors have been making choices for their lives a long time. They just don't realize it.
Mm,
And those choices have kept them alive,
mm,
have kept them safe, sort of,
mm,
and protected them. Learning how to channel that in ways, in positive ways, that move them toward health and healing is
mm,
transformative.
mm. We touched upon the power of silence, the power of showing yourself the love and respect to listen to what is waiting to be released inside. This is such a difficult task, yet such a fundamental task. And you can only get better at it when you practice that. No two ways around it. Are there other
And I
low
think
hanging?
every religion of the world has this element in it.
Hmm, true,
Well, let's pull this element out and make it available.
absolutely. So, are there other low hanging fruits that are easy to be implemented as far as the heart system is concerned?
I think most of it is, especially for trained therapists, I think it is a model that is easy to learn, um, but will take a lifetime of using to understand what it does.
Hmm,
Um, and every client is different. There are clients that will say, I want nothing to do with God. Okay. I use the secular part of the model because that works.
hmm.
Um, it just doesn't take it to the deeper level that I believe people get when they address spirituality in their life. Um, but
I
to
think
get
you,
well,
from a
yeah,
healing, yeah,
use the secular part of it.
absolutely. I think what you're touching upon is finding the purpose, finding the meaning of your life or meaning in your life. And that can
Mhm.
be so hard. Uh, Many of the men around me who I've sort of got to know and recently touched base with, they find themselves in a void. They find themselves in an emptiness where the kids have left the house. Some of them are in financial trouble. Some of them are in health problems where they identified themselves in a New Zealand style positive macho way. I'm a worker. I am a welder. I'm a bricklayer, whatever they are. Blue collar jobs typically, and then their shoulders give out, their back gives out, their knees give out, and suddenly the rug is pulled from underneath them. Who are they when they are not the superb bricklayer, when they are not the superb welder? And it's that emptiness, that void, combined then with other uh, maybe unresolved traumas in the past, that puts many men at the edge. And when I say middle aged, I mean, this is my age group. But if we were to look here in New Zealand at youth suicide rates, we are the second highest in the OECD. So there's the same thing there. You're identifying yourself with this New Zealand sports culture, for example. Everyone wants to be in the All Blacks, the rugby team, but there are only so many places in a rugby team. So, yeah, how do you find that purpose in life? And I think any way how we can open the darkness up a little bit. I often found it like a corridor, and it's pitch black, but there is this one little opening of a door, and there's a bit of light shining through. If you can crack that open a bit further and show that there is hope, show that there is actually some meaning waiting for you to make you understand why you have gone through what you have gone through and put things to bed and move on and find the new you that is waiting to come out, the phoenix rising from the ashes. And I think if we can instill that bit of hope, this would be so good because it's there. Depression
But
lies
if
to
you were
us.
honest with yourself, didn't that start much earlier, like in your high school years? Didn't you start looking, sensing, questioning? Most of us have,
Hmm.
or sometimes it's delayed a little bit into your 20s, but at some point we do start looking. We just don't talk about it a lot because we don't want to be made fun of. We don't want to have people think
Hmm.
we're crazy or off base. But I I understand that point in middle age where things change, and I certainly went through that stage. I left a marriage and had to deal with my children about that, wrestled through that, able to reconnect and really have good, solid relationships with my kids as adults. Um,
How old are they now?
my son, let's see, my son is 44.
All right.
My daughter is just turned 40.
May I ask how long did it take? Because often enough, we are now living in a society where we want instant gratification, instant success. I want it now. I don't want to work for it, but I want to have it now. There's the sense of entitlement, certainly for younger generations. Yet here you were divorced, upset, upheaval. Um, you started working, and in all fairness, you have got a skill set that is probably way beyond the skill sets of many of us. So, how long did it take you to reestablish a connection?
I knew enough to not mess with their lives. In other words, to allow them their choices in life without having The only time I would say anything is if they came directly to me and said, we want your opinion on this.
Mm,
Um, so I knew enough, and I've held that. I'd say with my daughter, it took probably about 5 or 6 years to
mm,
really solidly uh, work through. She was on her own, traveling, began seeing a lot of what I had been through and really understanding it. My son was very much the same way. It took about 4 or 5 years. He was a little faster on that
mm,
um, because when I left, he took the brunt of a lot of things that happened um,
mm,
in the home. Um, I
mm,
religiously paid my child support and had my visitation and
mm, mm,
used it to connect, used it to play, used it to help
mm,
them with school, whatever was needed in that.
mm.
Um, so
It's
it's not
beautiful.
something that just happens. You've got to work at it.
Absolutely. And I think that's the point. I assumed that would be your answer because we somehow want it fixed. Men especially, we are often the fixers and we want to do something now and then we get incredibly disappointed and disheartened if an action that you take does not immediately lead to the desired consequence. That they say, oh, Dad, we love you to bits. It takes time and healing takes
And that's
time.
and that's true for the clients I work with. I
Mm.
mean, even as human beings, we want what we want when we want it. And, you know,
Yeah.
I don't know that I've worked with anyone that didn't want to get well immediately. Um, and talking about the stages and the steps
Mm,
and
yeah.
going through the process. I will say that everybody I have worked with that has stayed long enough to complete the process got well.
Mm.
Um,
Isn't it?
and
Isn't it? It is. I think that is the key that you have just said. When you live with intention and when you take action in a consistent way by knowing your
yeah,
goal, by knowing where to walk towards, that is power. And we have got that power of choice every single second in the day. And it's this living intentionally and taking action.
mhm,
And
yeah,
it is impossible not to get better. We keep forgetting that. But there are so many forces which are holding us back, most of them sitting inside of us, who are holding us back. And you need to be clear about that. And for that, you need to be silent. And you need to see, well, okay, why do you not want to address an email that has come in? Why do you not want to address your finances that are completely shot? Because typically it's fear
mhm,
avoidance as a coping mechanism. So, okay, what can you do to actually address that? Maybe figure out where it comes from. And then maybe once you have got an answer there, it becomes easier to understand that what you're experiencing, let's say fear avoidance as a coping mechanism here, is something that is more or less normal. That is, I mean, so many other people out there are having the same thing, even very successful people. The question is, well, how can we model those successful people? How can we actually find ways how to deal with a coping mechanism? And again, it's trying to find small but measurable steps you can take and to get towards that. And I think this journey looks unique for every one of us. We have to figure out the right steps, but it will include very pragmatic steps, and it has to include some spirituality, the meaning of
mhm,
life, the purpose, etc. Because if you just separate them, only focus on one, you're bound to fail. Just as much as if you only focus on church and go on a Sunday morning to a happy, clappy church, and I'm so good, and it's basically escapism. I feel so good in the presence of God in church, and there are 50 people around me shouting, and it's wonderful. And you go home, you want to cry because your life is a mess. So it has to be both parts. And I love it that today
There's
we
got
are
to be
talking,
balance.
isn't it? Absolutely.
There's got to be a balance.
Mhm. Oh, beautiful.
Um, are you familiar with a technique called EMDR?
Yes, I am. I've
Okay.
never experienced it myself, unfortunately. I've never actually. I would so love to actually experience it.
It's for those that are listening, eye movement um, desensitization and reprocessing.
Mm,
It speeds up the process of being able to process a lot of information very quickly.
mm,
So it speeds therapy up. That's the purpose of it. And I found, especially dissociative clients, I found that sometimes speeding that up really helps them to deal with it because they get to deal with it at a distance
mm,
and not feeling like they're in the middle of it.
mm,
And that the resolution that they get allows them to function better,
mm,
allows them insights that they haven't been able to get
mm.
with other methods. Um, and I've been experimenting with using the heart model intermittent with EMDR,
Makes
and I'm
sense.
finding that it works very well.
Absolutely. And again, it's integration. It's integration because there will
Yep.
be certain body focused trauma therapies that are releasing so much. It is not uncommon when you speak to people who run a yoga studio and are into a trauma focused yoga that they tell me about clients who are just sobbing their heart out because we know that issues lie in the tissues. And it sounds like a cliche, but it does. As we know that memory is not just something that is confined to the brain. It's very much in the cells of our body, in the fascia of our body. So again, if we
It's
were to
in
look at
every cell of the body.
exactly. So if we were to actually look at different modalities, instead of saying, oh, let's compare that with that, no, why don't we say, let's put it all together? Let's imagine a big spider web and it has got many, many, many strings. And you can pull here a bit, you could pull there a bit, and it all results in movement in the spider web. So you can
I
address
keep
the.
telling my students the more technique that you know how to use,
Hmm,
and from different, whether it's theories, techniques, um, ways of interacting with your clients. I mean, one of the big things that's happening now is a huge movement having to do with electronics, where they're looking at the brain waves
hmm,
and
hmm,
modulating the brain waves.
hmm,
Um, I think that's going to be explosively useful
hmm,
going forward.
hmm.
I've
Exactly.
already, I mean, I've seen how this stuff works. It is just absolutely amazing.
Hmm.
And the clients that get that before they go into a regular counseling session, it's like doubling up or tripling up the
Absolutely.
impact.
Absolutely. And that is so
um,
amazing. And we are finally, as a society, are willing to explore that and look at it from a science-based, evidence-based point of view. If we were to look at the advances, the recognition we have got with regards to certain psychoactive substances, the psilocybin and many other substances out there, MDMA. It's a shame the FDA has just refused the approval of MDMA for the user in PTSD, etc., which is a bit of a shame because it is what it is. I think we will see.
Although they have allowed the studies to continue.
I see. I see. Ah, now that's good. Oh, that's good, actually. So there you go. So it's not yet a thing that can be advocated for, but at least they have recognized that there is maybe some
There's
virtue in
something
that.
there. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think if we can then start bringing that all together, I think that is where our life will explode. That is where our humanity will grow. I think if we look at it from that point of view. Yet at the same token, we would think, hang on, the world is just falling apart. We have got Ukraine, we have got Gaza, we have got Lebanon, we have
Yeah.
got North Korea, you name it. You've got the divided states of America. Um, so, my goodness, are we not torpedoing all that? Or are we just still being led around by the mainstream media that really, in reality, it is not as bad? But then again, we have just said 1 in 4 women will be raped. So not as bad. Hang on.
Mm.
So
Well,
where are we
it's
in?
interesting. One of the things you mentioned is research.
Hmm,
And the heart model was normed on 7 years research with 8 treatment programs across the United States for trafficking survivors.
cool.
Now, the reason we chose trafficking survivors is that 201, they have diagnoses of PTSD, borderline personality disorder, or dissociative identity
Hmm,
disorder.
hmm,
In other words, the trauma spectrum.
hmm.
And what we found, and there's a chapter in the book. Can I hold the book up? Is that okay?
Yeah. Oh, yes, please. The heart model.
um, the heart model. The subtext is an integrated faith-based and psychological approach to heal from trauma and produce balance in the mind, body, and spirit.
Beautiful.
Um, but we normed it on this purposely because we wanted, first of all, we wanted to subject the model to research because we want to establish it as a best practice.
Hmm,
And my plan basically is to try to replicate this in Europe, Africa, and Asia,
hmm,
um, so that we can make inferences around across the world
hmm,
if we get similar results, which I hope we will, but we'll see.
hmm,
But the net results showed a significant decrease of all the symptoms of PTSD. It showed a significant decrease in depression, anxiety, and
hmm,
dissociation,
hmm.
whether they were adults or adolescents. Um, and we saw a significant increase
Hmm.
in personal self esteem, um, and positive God image. So they began to see themselves as worthy. They began to see themselves as as
Wow.
uh, having a place in this world,
Yeah.
and many of them getting to a place of going after it.
Beautiful.
Um, Something that you
Instilling
said
hope,
earlier.
instilling hope. And it's basically being a catalyst, basically giving them a push start so that they can actually go out there. Because whatever we are as leaders, as guides, as mentors, as therapists, we can't be there for people all their lives. We need to be able to start them off with something where they say, wow, okay, I can do that. And then take tiny steps, baby steps. But often enough, they then end up running and becoming leaders and mentors and maybe therapists themselves, which is beautiful. That's exactly what that's the only thing we can inspire to do. We can't
You
cure the
know,
world.
it's interesting you say that. One of my early clients um, came in. She had had a lot of therapy. A number of people got the diagnosis right, but they kept kind of opening her up. It's like every experience would just open her up, find out about the experience, but they didn't take any time to put her back together again.
That was the criticism of the talk therapy, isn't it?
And so I had about 2.5 years with her, and she came to a place where she was able to integrate.
Hmm.
Um, she worked as this is a public story because there's a book on it, which is why I can talk about it.
Hmm.
Um, she went back to school. She was a hypnotherapist, went back to school, had background in teaching and helping people, smoking cessation, things like that with hypnotherapy. But she got her master's and then her doctorate, master's in counseling, her doctorate in clinical psychology. Moved to Denver, or the Denver area. I think she was in Boulder, and had an international career of traveling all around the world to talk about healing, especially from sexual trauma. She died a few years ago in her 80s, but an amazing client.
Wow.
So, yes, they become therapists, good ones.
And become, yeah, find a meaning in the suffering. Viktor
Yep.
Frankl, I mean, it is, there's so many beautiful examples out there. When I say beautiful, I mean, you see the most horrific circumstances, and people come out of them and say, wow, okay, I've gone through all that. What's the meaning of that? And often to tell others, to speak out, to find a connection with others. That's so
Yep.
beautiful. And again, that is, again, coming back to the heart model, that is, I think, where it is so valuable because the spirituality, the connection, all that is linked with a more secular model. I think that is what is missing. The connection, bringing everything together, tying things together, and taking, I guess, taking spirituality out of this woo woo out there and bringing it into the ivory towers in this case. Literally, we are actually,
Well, again, this is why we did the
yeah,
research. We wanted, first of all, to make sure that it would work.
mm,
And second of all, if it was going to work, it need it. I'm hoping some of my students will take it and do other things with it because we want to know the different aspects of the model
mm,
may need to be tweaked, may need to be adjusted. We know right now it's working, but
mm,
it can work better. I
true.
know that. We all know that. And that's true of any theory.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Um, so,
Oh, Ben, you're an amazing man. I mean, that is, it was beautiful to talk to you today. Thank you so much for sharing your heart model with me today, with my listeners and viewers, but also, of course, in your book out there. Tell me more. Where can people buy the book? Where can people find you?
uh, the book is on Amazon,
Mm,
and I understand Barnes and Noble can also get it.
mm,
Um, and you can find me at bkeys at divinemercy.edu.
perfect.
That's it's real simple and it's a direct line to me.
Perfect. Guys, look down there into the description of the YouTube video and of the podcast because all of the information of Ben is down there. Whilst you're down there, please press the like and subscribe button and tell your friends about it if there's something that you found of value in this beautiful interview. I certainly got a lot out of it. Certainly, being a humanist and atheist, it is always intriguing for me to speak to someone who is strong in his belief. And it is beautiful for me to do so because I expose myself to a different way of thinking and I always come away in a positive way. I've learned heaps from you today, and I think that is so important. Let's sit around the table. Forget the divisions. Let's find the commonalities. Let's find the ways how we can integrate, how we can work together to make this world a better place. But with that, we need to start with ourselves. How can we make ourselves, the inside of ourselves, a better place? And that's where on both physical and spiritually, that is where your heart model comes in. That's where functional medicine comes in, the practice of me looking at all those aspects of health that are often so integrated and so difficult to tease apart. We can do so much. There is hope, and the past does not equal the future. I think that is what I want to leave everyone out there with. Ben, you're an amazing man. Thank you so much for your time.
And Stephen, so are you. I really have enjoyed speaking with you, and it's not often that I find, even with people that do podcasts, that the level of openness that you seem to have, and that really gets shared, I'm sure, in all kinds of directions with other people that come along. So
Mhm.
thank you for being that, and thank you for being here today.
Absolutely. And you guys out there, look after yourself and live with intention. Bye.
Amen.